Hi everyone, nice to see you all, except I can't really see many. There's some familiar names and faces. As Jess said, I'm Nikki. I'm from the Burnie office of the Tasmanian program of the Australian Childhood Foundation. I'm going to share my screen with you all. So I wasn't going to do a PowerPoint usually because I talk and talk and talk, but I thought for today, to keep me on track, I would do it. Also, because I'm going to talk about visuals, so I thought I'll practice what I preach a little bit today. So I will just share that with everybody. Hopefully it will listen. Lovely. Hopefully everybody can see that. It always feels very strange. I'm going to talk about things like relationships today, and it always feels a bit odd in this type of circumstance where I can't see you all or be in a room with you, or hear you all laughing at my hilarious jokes. So that's going to be tough for me. But I'm really glad you guys all came along today. So yes, we're doing some chatting about brains and bodies and the impact of transitions and what that looks like for children and young people and for ourselves as adults, because we experience this just the same. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is brains, because it's really, really important. This is something, of course, we all share. And our brains relatively are all the same, but the way they work can be quite different. And that's because we all have different developmental experiences that mold our brain and change the way that we perceive the world and how we experience what happens around us. So this is a lovely picture of the brain. I'm not going to go into super lot of detail about it today because we do not have time. But the way that I am going to talk to you all about it today is using Dr. Dan Siegel's hand model of the brain. So some of you might have heard of this before. It is a fantastic way of talking and communicating with children and young people about the brain, about what happens in their bodies, and being able to express how they're feeling at the moment. So I will show you guys. Feel free to join along. I won't be able to see, so it's fine. This is the brain. Imagine this is the brain. This here is our spinal cord and our brain stem. And like you saw from that picture before, which I'll just flick back to, there's a lot more going on in the brain, but we're just focusing on these parts today because we're going to talk about our bodies and regulation and how we experience transitions. So we've got the spinal cord, we've got the brain stem, that's the part that does all that regulatory stuff, our heartbeat, our breath, our blood pressure. And then we go up here and we're going to go here, which is our limbic system. So you might have heard of the limbic system before. It's like our emotional center of the brain. And this is really important to do with transitions because this is one of the areas that's being impacted most. So we've got our limbic system here, and there's two really important parts to that I want to concentrate on today. One is the hippocampus, which is one of the areas that's responsible for memory in the brain. And then right here where our thumb is, as you can see on that picture, is our amygdala. And I'm going to come back in a moment and talk a bit more about our amygdala because it's really, really important in regards to what happens with our bodies when we're experiencing transitions. So over the top of this part of the brain, so where we've got our limbic system and our hippocampus and our amygdala, is the cerebral cortex, this part up here. And that's the part that does all that sort of upper thinking, reasoning, logic, all big picture stuff. And then right here at the front, as you can see on that pic as well, we've got our prefrontal cortex. Now, this is the last part of our brain to develop, and it usually doesn't develop until we're in our late 20s. So it's a real reality check to realize how long it takes for our brains actually to develop fully. And the prefrontal cortex does the highest level of integration and processing. So for you in all your positions, say you're working in schools or in counselling with children and young people, or even with your own children at home, you are their prefrontal cortex because they haven't developed theirs fully yet. So that's really up to us to be that for young people. So the important thing about showing you all this is that when we talk about transitions, they can be really, really challenging. And you might have experienced that at work or at home with young people, or even ourselves, because we can be all challenged by those types of experiences. And because they are underlined by change, transition is change. And change for our bodies can sometimes feel like a really, really scary thing. Now, the work that we do at the Australian Childhood Foundation is dominantly focused on children who've experienced what we call developmental trauma or complex relational trauma. And this stuff's really important to know because their bodies have gotten really, really good at keeping themselves safe. And so they need a lot of help with regulatory assistance with their brain. But everything that I say today is for everybody. It is not just for children who've experienced trauma. It is for adults, young people, children, anybody in your life who needs support with this area. So like I said, we've got all these areas and we've got the limbic system and the amygdala here. Now, the amygdala is so important for us to understand in regards to transitions because it's the smoke detector of our brain. It is the part that alerts us for real or perceived danger. That's also a really important thing for us to know about, because sometimes when our body has a reaction to things that happen, it might not because there be a real threat, could be because of a perceived threat. And our body got really good at detecting those threats and protecting us. So what happens when the amygdala gets set off, a bit like a smoke detector, is that, say we've got our brain fully on, say for instance we're sitting in class, we're trying to listen to the teacher and keep all of this part at the top, the cerebral cortex on, so that we know what's going on and we're paying attention, we're taking in information. And something happens. Say it could be a direct experience of a loud noise, like a door slamming or a teacher coming in, or it could be something that our body perceives as a threat, like a smell or a particular statement made by somebody or a sensory feeling on our body. Now, what happens to our brains at that moment is we flip our lids. And this is a really cool thing about what Dan Siegel teaches. And I highly suggest for anybody to Google and find out much more about him and talking about the hand model, because this is a great way to teach young children about how their brain works and what's happening when they become dysregulated. So when their body becomes uncomfortable and goes into a space where it's not feeling safe. So we flip our lids, and we flip our lids to keep ourselves safe. It's really, really important because this part, the amygdala, was developed essentially for that. So I like to say, and if anybody's seen me talk before, I often talk about, say if you're crossing a road and we didn't have this mechanism for our amygdala to take over and turn off all that upper thinking and just do the base stuff that keeps us safe, we would be walking across a road and we'd see a car coming and we'd go, oh, that's a nice green car. And I think I know Jen who drives that car. And wouldn't be very good at all. It would be really, really not great. So,
yeah. Nikki?
Yeah.
I'm so sorry. We're just going to have to pause really quickly. We've just been alerted that some people are still in the waiting room. We're going to let them in. I'm so sorry. We're going to let them in really quickly and then we can keep going.
That's okay. That's okay.
So sorry about that. So
you're fine. That's great. More people. That's wonderful.
Okay. Some people might have actually just missed your incredible spiel just then about the model of the brain.
Awesome. Yes. So anybody who just popped in then, you're going to see what we've just been chatting about, which is the hand model of the brain. And I'm just talking about the role of the amygdala, which is right here in our limbic system, and what it does to keep ourselves safe. So really simply, all it does is it turns off all of our upper thinking. So when something happens, real or perceived threat, all that upper thinking turns off and our amygdala takes charge. So what happens when that occurs is our body goes into a state of dysregulation. So you can sort of see that as two areas, and you might have heard of things like fight, flight, or active freeze and immobilization. So they're the different phases that our body shifts into to keep us safe. And depending on what your experiences are when you're young and how you develop and what you're exposed to and what works best to keep you safe, then determines as you grow what you most likely go to when you become dysregulated. So for some of us, that might mean our bodies get hyperaroused. So our blood pressure increases, our heart rate increases. We might want to do things like yell or run or fight to get our needs met or to keep ourselves safe. And for some other people, depending on their developmental experiences, they might become what's called hypoaroused, which means their body reduces their heart rate, their blood pressure, and can go into a state, like I said, which some people call active freeze, some people call immobilize, but it's pretty much a state in which we start to shut down. So that can look like things like hiding or removing ourselves from situations, disassociation, or being unable to speak. So those are the things that can happen when we flip our lid. So when there's real or perceived threat, our brains do what they have to do to keep us feel safe And this is what the amygdala does. It takes over, it pushes us into hyperarousal or hypoarousal, and it keeps us safe. But this is really important with transitions, because often in transitions, especially for children and young people who find them not a safe thing, their brain is going to flip its lid. And that means it's going to turn off all this higher processing, problem solving, thinking, and it's just going to go back to its base safety and do what it needs to do to keep itself safe, which you might see then. It might be running, it might be yelling, it might be hiding, it might be disassociating, depending on what's worked best as they develop to keep them safe. So I wanted to show you all this because it really underlines what's going on in the brain for children and young people in transitions. The other element about the brain I want to teach you all about is the hemispheres. So we have a left and a right hemisphere. And before, when I spoke about the development of the brain, it's vertical. So it starts down here with our brainstem and goes all the way up over onto our prefrontal cortex. But also what's happening when the brain develops, it's developing right hemisphere to left hemisphere. So as you can see on the screen at the moment, the left hemisphere is the one that does all that big picture stuff around what's right and wrong, cause and effect. It can understand the past, the present, and the future. It can do a lot of integrative stuff. So sometimes if you're a really ordered person who needs all your ducks lined up in a row, people might say you're a bit left brain. And then our right hemisphere is the part that's all orientated in present moment. So it's a real survival part of our brain, this hemisphere, and it looks at eye contact and prosody of voice, so the tone of your voice and how it goes up and down. It looks at how the face is moving, and it is all based around relational primacy or what happens in relationships. That's because our relational templates, so the part that means that we learn about if adults are safe or unsafe or how they treat us when we're developing, all that's stored in the right hemisphere as well. Now, I teach you this very importantly because when we flip our lids, so say we're going through a transition, we're going from class to recess, and for my body, that feels really, really super unsafe. My body is going to do what it needs to do to keep myself safe. So it's going to flip my lid. The amygdala is going to take charge. And say for me, that's something that pushes my body into hyperarousal, because that's what worked for me when I was developing. Yelling really loud, making my body really big. And when this happens, we go back to our right hemisphere. So not only have we flipped our lid and lost all of that upper thinking, we've also come back to dominantly living in our right brain. So we're no longer thinking about what the impact of what we're doing is, what's going to happen in the future, what people will think about me if I'm flipping my lid. I am only thinking in that moment about what's happening, how bad my body feels, and also what the adults around me are acting like. What do their faces look like? How are their bodies moving? And this is really important because a lot of the time when young people and children are flipping their lids, they will be looking to us for cues of safety. So that means if we're looking them right in the eye and saying things like, why did you do that? We might then keep that lid flipped because that's not safe and doesn't indicate any safety to the young person. But if we take time to calm our bodies and regulate and be curious about what's happening with them and be patient, we can assist their bodies and their brains to regulate, putting that top part of the brain back on and getting them back in this present moment. That's why that stuff's really important. I'll come back to that quite a bit as we chat. If anybody's got any questions, remember you could ask and I'll try my best. So the other element I want to talk about before we get further into the transitions is relationships, because they are essential to human development. Humans are just spectacularally brilliant in the fact that we need relationships to survive. Babies can't just be let go to go off and scrounge for food themselves and navigate the world without support. Babies need somebody to care for them and give them understanding of the world around them. Now, why I talk about this is because relationships in transition are really important. One, for the fact that regulation is taught by adults to children. So when the brain's developing, and remember this was the limbic system, the part that's all about emotions, babies are born with this developing. So they have the capacity to feel all these emotions. To regulate them, they don't have that skill yet. And that's the skill that they learn through their relationships with adults. So we know that if children are around adults who find it really hard to regulate their body, say that they're adults or flipping their lid all the time, then children will really struggle to learn that skill themselves because they don't have a model for it. So it's really important that we understand that, because in a lot of the roles that we do, say that we're counsellors, teachers, parents, caregivers, we can start to model those behaviours to children and young people so they can develop those skills. And that's through something that we call regulation. So that's where, when we talked about hyper and hypoarousal, those parts of dysregulation, regulation is the part where we can bring our bodies back into that sweet spot, that part where we feel safe and comfortable and things feel predictable and consistent. And we can do that through lots of different activities. We can do it through attunement, which really just means knowing each other. We like to use the word attunement a lot, but sometimes I think it can be a little bit of one of those big words, but really it just means knowing each other. So what I want to encourage with a lot of the transitions work that you might do or support young people with is understanding how important relationship is in that, because the knowing each other is really important. If a child knows an adult is predictable and consistent and they can show the child that they can regulate their bodies, then a transition feels a lot less scary and it's a lot less necessary for the body to flip its lid to keep itself safe because it feels safe in the first place. So relationships are so important to transitions. And again, with attunement and knowing each other, there's lots of wonderful things we can do, and I highly encourage continuing looking that stuff up if it interests you. There's lots of activities you can do in play, either at home or in school and in the community, such as mirroring games, so games where you copy each other. Stories and role plays are great, reading with each other. Games in which you use facial mannerisms. These are all ways to connect and create attunement or knowing each other, which can then help create any supports for transitions or teaching new skills or doing anything new in a child or young person's life. So hopefully that all makes sense so far. We've got our brains, they're really cool. They do what they do to keep us safe, which is really, really wonderful. But sometimes we need support to regulate our brains and make sure we get back to all this upper thinking so we can learn, connect, regulate, and feel calm and connected. So one of the parts I want to talk about now, before I get to regulation strategies, is something called PACE, which, just building off relationships again, is a wonderful set of strategies created by Dan Hughes, who you might have heard of, another fantastic person in this sphere, who speaks about PACE, which is a theory developed around attachment, so the relationship between caregiver and child, dominantly mum and bub. And the way that we communicate with each other and the ways that that can create safety and predictability. So PACE just stands for playfulness, acceptance, curiosity, and empathy. So pretty simple. And I think when I talk about this more, you'll probably all be sitting there going, oh, I already do so much of that stuff and this really works. And I've been doing that for so long and that's what I do with my kids. Before I keep talking about that though, and I usually say at the start, but this is all really wonderful stuff to know and to use, but I don't want anybody walking away today feeling like you have to be pressured to be 100% perfect all the time with these types of strategies or in our understanding. Modelling regulation in particular is wonderful and gives children and young people so much in regards to their capacity to learn about their own bodies. But we will also have so many times when we are dysregulated, when we flip our lids and it takes us a really long time to pop the top back on and to calm our bodies. And we can't have an expectation that's unrealistic. All we can do is do our best. And that means some of the time we'll get it great, some of the time not so great. And it's still wonderful if we're just trying. So on that, PACE is a great strategy that I think you'll all have times when you know you've used these types of elements and it's worked really well because it's innately just built off what we know in regards to relationships and what works. So PACE, the playfulness part, is all about that connection through playfulness. So the lightness of relationships. It doesn't specifically have to mean play. I'll talk about that in a minute because play is really beneficial. But It means having a relationship with someone that's built on the lightness and the connection. So that can mean creating activities or speaking in a way that can be quite playful rather than directive or authoritative. The A for acceptance is accepting that that's how the child or young person is feeling at the moment. It might not mean that you agree with the behaviour that they're demonstrating. Say they're flipping their lid and the thing that they go to first is flipping their table in class because that's what their body feels like it needs to do to keep itself safe. Acceptance doesn't mean that you love that they flip that desk, but acceptance means that you understand that that's at this time what their body felt it needed to do to keep itself safe. And acceptance and expressing that to others can really shift our body system and our nervous system, the part that's in charge of all that dysregulation and regulation, into feeling safe and calm and bringing us back into regulation. The C is curiosity, and this is the one I love most. Curiosity is really important, particularly for something like transitions, where sometimes we won't know why a children or young person has flipped their lid. We can see that maybe a transition's coming, or there's a situation there that you think that they might be not so happy about or might not find safety in, but you might not know specifically why. And so curiosity is a wonderful strategy in letting children and young people know that you care, and also finding out more in a really respectful way about what might be impacting them. So say, for instance, if a young person was having a lot of trouble putting their shoes on before school in the morning, we might sometimes feel that need to go, oh, every day this happens. It takes you 20 minutes to put your shoes on because we're dysregulated and maybe we're flipping our lids. But if we look at pace, we could be playful and we accept that that's their experience at the moment. And then we can be curious about why that's happening. And we might use our tone. Remember earlier on when we spoke about the brain and that right-hand side of the brain, that it's all focused on tone. So we might use a playful tone, and we might use curiosity to be like, I wonder why. It's really tough every day for you to put your shoes on. And I can see that that seems so tough. Now, the response you might get the first time might not give you any information, or the second or the third, but at some point, once using those types of strategies, you might find that the child or young person is able to go, well, it's because it scratches the side of my foot, or they feel too tight, or it's because shoes putting on is the last thing that happens before we go to school. So it feels like the indication of the transition. And that's going to give you a lot more understanding of what their experience is and why their body is flipping its lid. And the E, one of the most fundamental parts of relationships and creating regulation and connection, is empathy. So the E is for empathy for that reason. It's about understanding that that's their experience and that that's really tough. Children and young people don't choose to flip their lids. Their bodies are doing that for them because of that real or perceived threat. If they could choose to switch that off and be like all the other kids and not have any issues with transitions or putting their shoes on in the mornings, I'm sure they'd pick to do that, but they can't, not yet. They need this help to do it. They need the support for regulation and the consistency that will come through some of the strategies we're going to talk about. But giving empathy can mean sitting with it. It can mean sitting with them when they're putting their shoes on, when that's a really tough time, and letting them know there's not a time pressure. It might even mean you changing the schedule so there's a longer amount of time to make sure that those shoes can go on so that their bodies can feel calm and be regulated before taking the next steps in transition. So pace is amazing. It's really, really wonderful. I highly suggest that's one of the areas, if anybody goes away today and wants to look up, please have a look at pace. And I won't be surprised if you all notice elements you already use every day at work, in your relationships with your partners or your friends or your children. And it's because it's something innately we know works. So a lot of the time we're already using it. So it's a really wonderful thing to understand. And the other thing I wanted to talk about, which I highlighted before, is play. Play is one of the areas that we can create that attunement, so that knowing each other. Because play helps us to keep our lids on, helps us to keep all of this upper thinking going because we feel safe and connected. So we don't need to flip our lids. So play is really, really important. And I also highlight play for the fact that in transitions, we sometimes might find that a child or a young person needs to learn a new skill. That might be part of why the transition's so challenging. And play is really, really cool because it takes about 400 repetitions for us to learn anything new. So for any of us, if we're learning a new skill like tying up our shoelaces or learning a particular type of artwork that we want to make, or learning how to use a particular type of information technology, it'll take us about 400 repetitions for the connections in our brains to get as strong as they need to be for us to learn that skill. The cool thing is, if we teach someone with play, so if something's learned through play, it takes about 10 to 20 repetitions. So that's a big time saver for one, but also it just shows how much play helps to keep the brain calm and helps it to be connected to all that upper thinking so that it can integrate all that wonderful information that's coming through and then implement it, say, into a learned skill. So play is wonderful for all those reasons. Great for connection, great for attunement, the knowing each other bit, and fantastic for learning new things. So play can really be integrated into transitions really successfully. Doing a time check. So on that, I'm going to talk about regulation and then we're going to talk about some other strategies to do with transitions.
If I could just interrupt really quickly, sorry, Nikki, just wanted to remind participants that they can raise their hand or unmute to ask you a question. I've just been told that some people are asking questions in Slack, so just keep that in mind. If you have any questions for Nikki, they can be asked at any time by unmuting or raising your hand for her. Thank you.
Thank you, Jess. Thank you. Also cool that people are asking questions. Thanks, even if it is in Slack. And hopefully I can still see it on the screen here. You just let me know if I don't see any questions that come up if I don't respond. So where was I? Oh, regulation. So like I spoke about before, regulation is so important because our brains grow with the capacity for taking in emotions, and we don't have the capacity when we're born to regulate those feelings. That's why babies cry a lot, because their bodies can feel all the stuff. They just don't know what to do with it. So as we get older and we develop, it's up to the important adults around us, be them our parents or caregivers or our teachers or the support people in our life or sports coaches or uncles and aunties, to be the ones around us who can help us to learn those skills. And the best way we can teach that is through modeling. So is us showing children and young people that we sometimes become dysregulated and then we calm our bodies. So again, this isn't something we can do perfectly 100% of the time. There is no way that can happen, but it's just about us trying. So us practicing ourselves when we get the opportunity and finding out what it is that works for us. So a couple of suggestions I would make around finding what works for children and young people is talking to them about it. And doing activities in which they get an opportunity to practice. So when I work with schools in particular, we do a thing called a chill out checklist, which you might want to call any other type of thing because that can be really lame to some students. But it's just a massive big map or list of all the different things humans do to make our bodies feel better, so to regulate. That could be things like having a hot Milo or skipping, or playing basketball, or playing with a fidget toy. There's so many different things for all of us that work. So I know you could all probably reflect now and think about when you're at work or at home and something happens and you feel not okay. So again, you're flipping your lid or about to flip your lid and your body's moving either up into hyperarousal or down into hypoarousal. What is it that you do that helps to regulate your body? For some people, it's going to have a hot drink or going for a walk outside. For some people, splash some water on their face. Some people, it's some really big, lovely, mindful, deep breaths. Different for everybody, just as it is for the children and the young people that we know. So I'd really highly encourage that this is one of the areas with tough transitions, so kids who are struggling with transitions, that you look at is what works for them. And say if you're supporting an entire class of kids or a group of children, you might even find some correlation. I know that I've worked with a school that when they did this activity, they found out that half of the students in the class loved skipping. That was what made their bodies feel really connected. They could go and have a skip and then come back into the class with their brains all on, ready to learn. So they set up a special area just for skipping. So there's no shame, no worry, no feeling of anything except for, I know if I feel like I'm about to flip my lid, I'm going to hop up, have a skip, and then I'm going to sit back down and I'm going to fully be here. So it's a wonderful thing to share with children and young people and for ourselves to practice. Sometimes we don't know what works for us until we have a really good think and a bit of a practice and a try with it. So transitions, while we're all here, hopefully all the information I've given you so far makes sense of why transitions can be really, really challenging, because they mean change, and change to our brains is often perceived as a threat because it's unpredictable. So what we know is that children and young people, particularly those that have had developmental experiences that have been really challenging, or they haven't had positive experiences of change, or they haven't had adults who are able to regulate themselves, they may be way more likely to flip their lids when a transition's upcoming. So there's some really important areas that I want us to talk about to do with this strategically. I think we've only got a bit left and I want you guys to be able to ask some more questions. The biggest thing I'm going to say is consistency and routines. So like we talk about this with the flipping our lid, it's because it comes from unpredictable change. So what we want to do most is remove that. We want there to be much predictability and consistency as possible. Again, can't be 100% of the time, but what we can do is try. So that might mean things like visual routines, and that's something we do a lot, say in primary schools. Primary schools are actually really wonderful at that. And then we lose it as we get a little bit older. And I'd love us not to lose that, because inherently so important for the way that we experience it, transitions and change, and can be fully present in the moments that are ahead of us. So visual routines are fantastic. At home, they are wonderful. They can be so essential in a child, knowing what's coming up in a day, knowing what's coming up in a week. And when I talk about these strategies, some of them will take time to implement, but what I can assure you is that the more effort you put up front with these types of strategies, like visual routines, the less effort you will have to put in the long run, because their bodies will adjust. They will start to learn the capacity of regulation and start to learn that transitions are safe. And then they can become less predictable and their bodies still have a sense of safety in it. But we need to start out with as much consistency and predictability as possible. So yes, visual routines are fantastic. Also for the fact that a lot of children and young people and adults, we experience and integrate new information in different ways. And for some people that can be visually. So having a visual timetable at home or at school is absolutely so important. Countdowns and warnings are really fantastic as well. Lots of time in counselling nowadays, we will do countdowns. So 30 minutes till we're going to finish up, and then you're going to go outside the door, and then you're going to be with mum. And I think mum said you're going to go and get a hot drink. Those are the types of areas that can create a lot of safety in the body, because if we don't know what time something's ending, our body might continually be wavering in this space of, will I flip my lid, because my body's quite unaware of what's coming next, and what's coming next might not be safe. And what we want from young people and children is for them to be able to have all that brain on, all that good upper thinking, processing, problem solving and integration. We want that there. So again, everything we want to do for transitions is to keep that lid on. So that's why things like warnings and countdowns are fantastic. You can incorporate those with visual aids. So you can have, say, for instance, Velcro rip-offs that the young person themselves can be in charge of taking off. You can say, hey, 5 minutes till we go, and the young person can take that off themselves. That's also a really important thing that I would suggest and support, is aiding our children and young people to have some sense of control in transitions. Even though we can use these other strategies, for some children, particularly those, sometimes children with ADHD or ASD, or who've experienced developmental trauma, transitions are going to be a whole chunk harder than they are for the rest of us. And so there's some other strategies like having some control over the situations that can be really, really beneficial. So that can be things like having a countdown timer. So having like a sand timer, one of those that you can say to the young person, okay, we've got 10 minutes until we're going to leave. Can you please be in charge of the sand timer? I need you to flip it over. And when all the sands run out, I need you to let us know, because that's when we're going to leave the house, or that's when we're going to go out to recess. Now, what that does is that helps the child or the young person focus in on that tangible element that they have control over. And then they can feel a sense of control in what might be an unpredictable moment. Those are really great strategies, in particular, if you can't fully provide predictability about what's coming next, say for something like recess that can be quite unpredictable. Giving them some sense of control before they walk into that environment can help them to regulate, keep that top of the brain on, and help them go into that space in a much calmer, regulated manner. Transitional objects can also be really helpful in that aspect, because they give that tangible sense of control and of predictability, because there's something that they know. For some children, that can also be a sensory input that gives them regulatory assistance. So that could be things like transition objects from school to home. So something that every day that you take to school and then you take from school to home. So there's a predictability in that occurring. It might be things like transition cards. So sometimes in schools, we might have the teacher write, "I'll see you after recess," on a card that goes with the young person out to recess, because that might be the one tangible thing they need to remind their brain and their body, after this unpredictable time, I'm going to go back into an environment with a teacher that I know is predictable. Same with, say that children are going to respite or to babysitting or to a family or friend's house. You could also use an item like a transition card, which you can just make up. You can do it with the young person, again, so they have control over it. It can be beautiful, or in whatever colours that they identify with, that you can write a note and even speak about what's going to happen when they come back home. So there's a predictability in what occurs. Again, we're doing all of this to keep the brain on. The more consistency and predictability, the less likely the body needs to flip its lid and think it needs to keep itself safe, because it already feels safe. Music can be really wonderful as well, because especially when for young people who associate particular songs with positive feelings, it can be really beneficial. And teaching new skills is another area that I want to make sure I just go over quickly, which sometimes when we're using that pace, so the playfulness, acceptance, curiosity and empathy, we might find that the young person is finding a transition challenging because they don't know how to do a part of it. So that might be something like doing up their shoelaces, or unsure how they need to get their lunchbox ready to go to school, or pack it up at school and go back. And if we're more curious and empathetic in our interactions, we might find out what that is and then work with them to learn that skill, which might actually ease the pressure of the transition. In class as well, buddy systems are fantastic. And if there's any teachers here, you probably use buddy systems to go to and fro class. They're really wonderful. What I would suggest is even increasing the predictability of those once again. So sometimes in class, we might call out and say, "Hey, everybody, grab your buddy." And everyone just gets with a random buddy. Again, that can cause some flipping of lids. So having consistent buddies of children that you know, maybe ones particularly for children who are dysregulated, children that help them regulate, and then having backup buddies as well. So there's always a sense of consistency and predictability in their routines. And choices is wonderful, but remember they need to be controlled choices. You don't want to ever give a child during a transition a choice that you can't go through with, like, "Oh, take whichever toy you want," or "Which toy would you like?" if they can't take whichever toy they want. You might need to get 3 toys out that you know they're allowed to take to the particular event and say, "Which of the 3 would you like?" Again, a sense of control that can help them feel regulated. And what I'll lastly say is praise, absolutely praise. Positive reinforcement for successful transitions, for trying and successful transitions, and for any opportunity that a child's practicing their regulation. Positive reinforcement done with that, all the body and the face, giving them all those indications, is what will help them integrate these experiences and find transitions a much safer experience. So I blah a lot, and I think I'm probably getting pretty close to time. So if anybody does have any questions, I will turn off my sharing. I did it. Well done.
Nikki, we might actually have to finish it up today because we do only have just a couple of minutes and people will need to move back to the keynote. But I guess we do still have the Slack channel open if anyone wants to chat with anyone else on that. I don't know if you're on that, Nikki, to answer questions, but that could be an option potentially. So if anyone does want to keep going with the Slack channel, it's workshop5_brainsbodies to keep talking. Thank you so much, Nikki. That was honestly an incredible presentation. I love your enthusiasm and there was just so much content. It was amazing. Thank you.
That's very nice. Thank you, Jess. Thank you, everybody, for coming and listening. I really appreciate it.